Podium Audio presents.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to TBRCon 2025, today's last panel, Sidekicks and Secondary Characters that Steal the Show. Joining me is an awesome group of authors, and I will let them introduce themselves in a second. But first, for those joining us live, feel free to add your questions in the comments. We will be going through them as we go, or even towards the end. So let's go in the row that we see each other, and we can start from Tommy. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what kind of books you write.
My name is Tommy. I go by the pen name SourpatchHero. I write a lit RPG called The Hero about two friends who fall into a magical world and try to figure out how to survive.
Oh, sorry, I thought I was muted. I'm Andrea Stewart. I write epic fantasy primarily right now. I am the author of the Drowning Empire trilogy and the recently released The Gods Below.
Hi, I'm J.S. Dewis. You can call me Jenny. I write sci-fi action adventure. My series, The Divide, has 3 books out now, starting with The Last Watch. Most recently, The Relentless Legion came out in November. And then I have a standalone called Rubicon, which is also military sci-fi. So yeah.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Luis Magalhaes, and I write in the Legends of Elysia series, which is heroic fantasy in a shared world. I have several series and some standalone novels and novellas, all set in the same world with different characters and storylines. And if you enjoy, tales of, daring or sometimes not so much daring, but dastardly heroes, right, that nonetheless try to do the right thing, you'll probably enjoy it. I'm finishing my latest series this February with the launch of Dragon of the Ice.
Hi, I'm Sebastien de Castell. I'm a Canadian fantasy writer. I'm probably most known for The Greatcoats, which is a swashbuckling fantasy series that now has a new follow-on series called The Court of Shadows, and this is the latest book in that, which is Play of Shadows, which I maintain is the greatest swashbuckling fantasy ever set in the theater, and no one has ever asked for a swashbuckling fantasy set in the theater. I also write the Spellslinger series, which is a young adult magical fantasy series, and the Malevolent 7 series, which started as kind of a joke and now strangely is doing better than expected. It's about wizards wandering around blowing things up and swearing constantly. So I suppose I should have predicted that would be more successful than other books.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fonda Lee. I am the author of a bunch of books. I'm most well known for the Greenbone Saga, which is a modern epic fantasy trilogy, which is complete. I'm also the author of a number of science fiction novels, a couple of novellas, most recently a book called Breath of the Dragon, which just came out last week, so I'm fresh off tour, and it is the first in a young adult fantasy duology that's co-written with Shannon Lee and the Bruce Lee estate. And yeah, excited to be on this panel and to chat with all of you.
Happy to have you. Apologies for the technical issue.
No worries. Glad to be here.
So we can start from you since you were last, and we can start from a general idea. We're here to talk all about sidekicks. How do each of you define a sidekick, and what is, in your opinion, the key function of one? Fonda, you can start, and we can just go backwards.
Sure. Yeah. So I think of the sidekick, narratively speaking, as being a character whose role it is to support the protagonist in their journey. And a sidekick I would differentiate from a secondary character being, any number of characters that are part of the narratives but a sidekick, I think the specific function of a sidekick is to be a support mechanism and to kind of illuminate the main protagonist's journey in some way. Oftentimes the sidekick's role as well is to be a conduit for the reader, to be a more relatable character or more accessible character for the reader to go along with the main character's journey. And oftentimes you see the sidekick taking on kind of a role that is often, and you often do see like the sidekick that is comedic or a bit bumbly or a bit fish out of water or a little bit less competent, right? Because they often are the character that contrasts with a main character that is hyper competent, which is why we often see sidekicks in genres like superhero fiction, where you have a protagonist that is so gifted and has abilities that the normal reader isn't going to be necessarily able to relate to quite as easily. Or, for example, in detective fiction, where you have a sidekick who is the more ignorant one, because it's going to be hard for a reader to be in the mind of the brilliant detective who's solving everything, but they can more easily access the story and have a relationship with that main character through a secondary character who is a sidekick and is helping that character, but is also a conduit into the story for the reader.
Good. I believe some technical term, usually they're often used like they are a foil for the protagonist. And like you said, it's I've often found that either the sidekick, when we do need them, when they are there to help us understand the protagonist, and they really do help guide us better, which they said. And so,
There's
Sebastien?
I just want following up on what Fonda was saying, because I agree completely. Like there's these two really interesting functions that sidekicks often play. One is almost as a kind of a herald for the protagonist, in the sense of they act as this kind of mirror that to sort of tell us things. Like they can say things about the protagonist. So the protagonist, Batman can't say, I'm so dour, I never do anything fun, because he's got to just be Batman. But Robin can kind of illuminate that for us to the audience. The other function that I find interesting about sidekicks is sometimes they almost act as a voice for the reader, talking back to the protagonist. In other words, saying things to the protagonist that the reader kind of really wants to say, like, why do you keep making this same mistake over and over? Or why won't you believe in yourself? And when I've noticed that with readers, when the sidekick says something to the protagonist that the reader really wants to say, readers really enjoy that feeling of, almost like they're getting to speak through that sidekick character. So that's kind of a fun function as well.
Yeah, I obviously I agree with all of that. Those are very salient aspects, right, of sidekicking. Let's say, to hold up a mirror to the character, and also to help ground the reader or the listener or the viewer on the mythology. I like to look at sidekicks also as some sort of the legacy aspect, right? I think it's important, especially as we get older and we all consider, legacies and etc. We like to see into the future of these characters that I love, and we like to feel like that sidekick is there as someone for the character that we love to pass on also their expertise and their knowledge and their responsibilities to a new generation. So I also like that aspect of the sidekick as the successor.
Yeah, I think everyone's made great points so far. I think I agree with that definition for sure. I really like what Fonda and Sebastien were talking about as far as being a conduit for the reader. Like, I like to use sidekicks like to show aspects of the culture and world building that you don't otherwise get a perspective on. Your MC, comes from a specific background in a specific place, and especially in my stories, there's usually like in military, you know, coming from a lot of different backgrounds, all coming together in one place for one purpose. So like having those aspects of, you know, you're never going to see this planet that's on the other side of the galaxy, but this person's from there, and they can kind of be that example of what that aspect of world building is like. So that's kind of how I like to use side characters sometimes.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add. I I think this has been pretty comprehensive. I would just say that I really like to use side characters or sidekicks to help push the main character along their character arc. So whether that's through challenging their way of thinking or like getting abducted and making the character realize that they actually do care about something, I just find them like a helpful tool to do that.
Yeah, you guys left me nothing to say. As far as sidekicks go, I definitely agree. They are very different than secondary characters. My main character is the sidekick, so it's a little bit of a difference for me writing the story from the perspective of, you know, the hero's best friend. But I try to always use it as a way to help the main character or the hero of whatever the story is move along to whatever the next thing he needs to do is. It's a really great tool to be able to use the sidekick to give them that impetus that, you know, the main character needs, the push to go further, to train harder, or you know, like Jenny said, it's also a great way to world build, to be able to give the secondary perspective of, you're a fish out of water, here's your sidekick who's going to explain to you, well, the rules of this town, this city, this new world.
So we've all got more or less the same idea. So as the sidekick as a conduit or to help the reader and the protagonist or the primary character explain themselves to the reader, have a better inner monologue potentially if we're not with a first person character.
I just want to add one thing, because Andrea, I think, brought up a great point, which was that another key role of the sidekick is often to humanize the protagonist, especially with those particularly hyper competent protagonists or protagonists who are a little bit inaccessible to the reader. Giving them someone who sees the main character or the protagonist in more unguarded moments creates that level of humanity for a character like that might otherwise seem more remote, like Batman, right, or Sherlock Holmes.
Well, and Tommy sort of pointed to something that I think is worth looking at as a distinction, which is, you know, the sort of distinction between the main character and the protagonist. Like I mean, people use these terms differently, and there's probably no formalized right way or wrong way to do it. But we often think of Sherlock Holmes as the protagonist, but Dr. Watson's the main character. We are following this, we are understanding this world through Dr. Watson. And so, you know, you can have a sidekick who is just a sidekick, and you can have a main character who has a function of a sidekick towards that protagonist, but is still sort of our main character that we're following. And so, you know, I think it's a useful distinction to make, to just know that you're not sort of bound by to have a sidekick by definition somehow not have to be your main character.
Mm-hmm. That's how my story started. I'd read so many wonderful lit RPGs where the main hero is the hero and going along, and he's got all of these sidekicks. And I was like, I wonder how it would feel to be one of those sidekicks. I'll start writing this, and here I am 3 books later.
Good. And stemming off a little from your own sidekick, Tommy, that became the protagonist, when do you think, or how does a secondary character or a sidekick steal the show, and how good or bad is that for the story, do you think?
I think that it's always a good thing after editing. I've definitely written a few times where I've realized that I've let somebody else take over the story, and I've had to parse that back a little bit. But as far as letting a secondary character, because again, my character is the sidekick, so letting a secondary character have the scene, let them have their moment to shine, if it's used in a way that can help your protagonist grow in some way, or give them some push that they need to be able to learn or grow or continue the story in whatever way they need to be, it can be a really great thing. It's just making sure that, unless you want to write a multiple point of view story, making sure that you stick with who the main story is about.
Okay, so I write multi-point of view stories. I'm kind of like, I mean, one of my modes of thinking is that, well, if you don't like these characters over here, well, I always have these other main characters that you may like better. And I do notice that people tend to gravitate toward different characters. I do think it's like partially a matter of taste, and it is sometimes a little bit subjective, but I do also think that there's a difference between a secondary character stealing a scene and a secondary character stealing the show, because I feel like that can sometimes be an indication that maybe you're writing the wrong story because you're finding the secondary character more interesting than the main character at that point.
I literally had just written down on my whole notepad, steal the scene, don't steal the show. I agree 100%. The thing is, the thing is secondary characters, sidekicks, they need to steal the scene sometimes, because when the sidekick is stealing the scene and the reader is kind of excited or cheering for that character, they're also getting like a breathing point, because typically the main character, certainly the protagonist, has this kind of constant weight and pressure that we put on them intentionally. And so when you have like a sidekick kind of steal the scene for a little bit, it just kind of lets the reader breathe. But as Andrea says, when you're at the point where you're trying to like crank that gear too much and you're going, wow, I've got this fun wild sidekick, like in the Spellsinger series, there's a talking squirrel cat who's a thieving and murderous business partner, as he calls himself, to the main character. I can always use that lever to go, this is going to be funny. Everyone loves when Rikus does these terrible things. But if you do it too much, either it starts to feel like you're now kind of stealing away from the energy of the story that you're trying to tell, or as Andrea said, you reach the point where, well, I guess the reader's either going to go, well, I no longer feel like I'm in the same story I wanted to be in. Or if they're loving that one too much, then going, yeah, I wish this was a whole, 150,000 word book about a squirrel cat. Why do I have to deal with this stupid human? And so it's, stealing the scene, not stealing the show, I think is really good advice.
Well, when they steal the show, I mean, that's as far as I'm concerned. We all have our different processes, and as Andrea pointed out, fantasy is the home for the multiple point of views. So, but when they steal the scene, you can extend the point of views, whatever, make it give. But that's you deciding, right? You decide that they stole the scene for you. That goes a bit with I suppose pantsing instead of plotting. Right, I myself like to plot lightly and then see where the characters take us. So when a side character steals the scene, I just tend to, extend the scene or have more scenes with him or her. But there's also the case that sometimes this happened to me with my current series, where there was this secondary character, which is a bit of a rogue, Frida, which I just started getting fan mail about her. She had, she intervened in a couple of chapters in a 40-chapter book, and then people started asking, "Oh, what about her? What's up with her? What happened?" And I'm like, "Oh, I guess this is the opportunity for a new series, for a spin-off series, for a spin-off book." So yes, I wonder, you guys, how often do you decide that the character is stealing the show, that the secondary character is stealing the show, versus how often do your fans and readers decide?
I keep a really tight rein on the focus of the story. I'm quite a control freak when it comes to my characters. I love it when they do unexpected things. I love it when they steal a scene. Those are really wonderful, surprising parts of the writing process. But I am always very cognizant of whose story is this, because I think that the reader has to intuitively understand what the nature of the story is. And I think secondary characters, to the extent that they, like Andrea and Sebastien pointed out, steal the scene in a way that is surprising, refreshing, illuminating, that's fantastic. But where the show stealing is risky and could be detrimental is when it becomes distracting, or when it becomes confusing for the reader to understand, well, whose story is this? Who do you want me to pay attention to? You should always still, as a reader, be aware of who is the focal point. So like my main trilogy, the Green Bone Saga, it's 3 books. It's like, I don't even know how many points of view are in it. I have not done the math, but there are a lot. And some of those points of view come in for only a single chapter in the course of like a 30-year saga, because they were needed in that moment. And some of them recur over and over again. But my litmus test for whether or not this should be of how much to lean into some of these secondary points of view was, it all has to kind of come back to what the story is, which is a family saga. So if it's not directly related to the story of this family and how their journey progresses, then it's distracting from the focus of the overall narrative.
Yeah, I think you have to be really deliberate as an author about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And yeah, that can come in edits. That's fine. You can write a first draft where it just goes completely off the rails. Not that I've had that happen to me, just kidding. But I think like you have to do things with intention, because really like you are like the guide on the raft, on this life raft that you're taking your reader on. If you don't know what you're doing, your reader is not going to feel very safe, or that like they know what the story is about, or that they know what's going on at all.
For me, I think I sometimes trip in the other direction, happily. So as a human being, I have this really bad habit that I will meet people, I will make pretty solid judgments about them. I will decide this is what that kind of person is, and this is why I hate them, because they're terrible. And then I'll slowly get to know them and go, oh my God, they're not anything like I thought. Like now I'm seeing this other layer, and this is really fascinating. And then they end up becoming really great friends. And so I find with writing, I tend to do that as well, where I'll sort of think I know who, and this is specific to secondary characters, where I think I know kind of who and what they are and what they represent. And then just by giving them some room to breathe in a scene, that'll change. So for me, my debut novel was a book called Trader's Blade. And there was a character in there named Valiana who was basically, meant to be the sort of kind of somewhat cruel, disdainful, noble sort of person who was born to rule, and as a very easy person for Falchio, this sort of wandering magistrate, sort of from a lower class, to kind of hate. And there's a scene where literally all that's meant to happen is that they're in this ballroom, and she's, he's told to dance with her or something, and he doesn't want to, and so he kind of acts in a slightly disdainful manner that's just as fractionally embarrassing to her. And the way that as I was writing the scene, that she responded to that, sort of suddenly opened up this doorway into a very different layer of that character. And then she ended up becoming kind of a really essential figure in the whole sort of Greatcoats quartet. And so sometimes that process of that's why I like the stealing the scene idea so much, like letting the character sort of steal the scene a little bit, because then you kind of get to decide, is this just a temporary, transient, fun moment, or is this going to actually alter the course of the story I'm telling? So I think it can kind of go both ways, but it is a risky thing to play with.
No, it's a very nice way to put it, and I like to see is that we all have our bags of tricks, right? As we're writing the book, and I like to see those moments as, oh, okay, I can add this character to my bag of tricks in case I need something like this right farther down the line. I hit the wall. I don't know. There's this situation. I don't know how to handle it. Then you can always reach in that bag of tricks and see if there's a character that's the right thing for that moment based on what you learned about them before.
And Jenny, what about you? Haven't had a chance. Pipe up.
Yeah, I'm kind of forgetting what the original question was. I think
When or
was it
how
about
does it, how do they steal the
stealing
show or the scene?
Yeah, I think what everyone said was really great as far as let them steal a scene, but don't let them steal the entire show. Or do and then make them a POV character in the third book, like I did. Like it just it happens sometimes. They're meant to be. I had a character who was just going to be the reliable second in command, and he ended up with. I'm more of a pantser, so as I wrote, he ended up with this whole complicated backstory that ended up really supporting the main themes of the story and the main plot in a way that just worked great. So I slowly sort of built him up from this, very sidekicky character helping, the two main POV characters into, someone who has their whole own arc and situation happening by the third book. So I think letting that happen and seeing what happens with it is a good thing, but keep an eye on it and make sure, that's something that you would be willing to entertain. And if not, maybe back down on it in earlier books. It just kind of depends where you're at in the writing process. But yeah.
Absolutely. And as a reader, that is definitely something that we enjoy finding. Like whenever we find a secondary character and we're like, I just feel I need more. And then there are times when we don't feel the need at all because the story is giving us already everything that we need. So, and we already touched on this a little bit, but what would you say to avoid doing when writing a sidekick or a secondary character if you want to make them into a sidekick? And we can even start from Fonda again.
I would say, and this is a personal preference of mine, say avoid making them campy or like trying to be too cute with them. Sometimes like a really, cute, campy side character or sidekick works. But I personally find that it often doesn't. Like it ends up kind of being a bit of a tonal disconnect if you've got like a sidekick that is just like too much it's just kind of like too ridiculous, a little too campy. Like, gosh, that dragon in Mulan. I can't even remember his name. That guy.
It's Mushu. I recall, yes. although he hit different with kids, right?
Yeah. So as I said, this is more of a personal preference thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like a matter of depth, right? It's like you can have somebody that is campy sometimes or humorous or cute, but they have to be rounded out and they have to have depth and they have to have a background. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets to kind of a good underlying point, which is we were talking about sidekicks and secondary characters as narrative tools, right? Which they are. I mean, we're writers. All of our characters are tools, but they are still their own person, right? Like the sidekick character is a human being. And if you don't write them as such, if you don't give them nuance, you don't give them full dimensionality, then they become really paper thin. And then that actually makes your story less compelling and less believable because you kind of have a caricature as opposed to a full character.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, building on that and a bit on what you said before about maintaining the focus right on the main character. That's true and important, and that's the way it should be done. But in the back of your mind, right, while writing, every character, every one of us is our main character, is the main character of our lives. And that should be true for all the characters in our books. They're not the main character of the book, but if there should be an alternate universe where there's a book about them where they are the main character, right? So I feel that's the way to do it. And conversely, to avoid seeing them as a secondary character, the way to write them well, to write them in a way that people will enjoy inhabiting their points of view, it is to write them as full-fledged characters. Don't take the view that, this is going to be my second character. I like to take the view of this is another person in my world. It might not be the main point of view, but it's a person just like the main character.
I love how Tommy went and took that all the way, and like now you're a sidekick, your main character.
Yeah, and I agree with everything both of you said about, making the character more than just one-dimensional, or how each character is their own hero of their own story. Doesn't matter which person in my book it is, I have way too many notes about random details that I've come up with about, oh, well, this is this person's history and the things that motivate them and what they want out of life. And I'm not going to use 85% of it, but by thinking through of, okay, well, the reason that this guy really wants to help my character is because he's got a past where something happened with his family and it's similar. And so now he's taking on that grandfatherly, teacher role. Why is he doing that? So I have a whole backstory for Tony the Mind Mage that no one will ever know about, because I love that. I love that I have a secret that I don't have to share with my readers, even though I've had them ask multiple times about what was that one sentence that he said about my brother.
Yeah, but it still really affects the way that they speak and act, and like with the way that they carry themselves, for sure.
Exactly. All of the little mannerisms that start to develop when you create their own background, their own history, what has affected them that makes them who they are at the point of your protagonist's story.
And I think a crucial thing for me, and that I often have to remind myself to do, is to give them agency, is to really focus on giving them agency, because none of us, I think, probably self-identify as sidekicks to someone else. And when you have like, why is that character's horse with them? We don't ask that question because the horse, is kind of stuck going where that person goes for the most part. But sidekicks, someone who's following along on someone else's journey has to have a pretty compelling reason for that. And it was interesting for me, like when I was writing the Greatcoat series, because there's a bit of a bromance there. There's three sort of characters, and but Falkio's you're the narrator and the main character, and Kest, is with him all the time, even though he disagrees with him a lot, because functionally he fundamentally he loves him, right? It's their best friend, and they have this bond, and so he's always going to be there. But Brasty, a character that lots of people like because he's very brash and he's always kind of skeptical of Falkio and things like that, there has to be a reason why he's still following along. And it was interesting because I was halfway through a book, the second book in the series, which is called Night Shadow, where I realized, well, given what's happened, Brasty's not going to keep being the sidekick now. He would leave. And so I sort of had him leave, and that actually can feel really poignant, even more so than a character, dying off or something like that. Just someone you're not expecting to leave actually leave. And then later, after he'd gone on some of his own sort of adventures, when he returns, there's a kind of a reestablishment. Like now we understand why he's coming along on this journey as well. So just always thinking about giving the character agency and having a reason of why they are following on someone else's journey, I think is really helpful.
Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, once again, I think everyone covered it really well. I just, I always try not to think of them as a tool, but that put myself in their shoes and see, experience the events through their eyes, what's going to motivate them, what's going to make them make the decisions they do, whether those be to help or not help. I think there's always the side characters who kind of act as, against the wishes of the main character, and that can be interesting as well. But just making sure those reasons make sense, and that you don't spoon feed it to the reader, but you give just enough to make the reader realize, like, oh, there's something in their backstory that just made them do that. What is that? And then that kind of draw the reader forward and interest them.
So we know, or rather, we have an idea of how sidekicks or secondaries are a good tool. But when does a story not need one? And I'm going to start with Jenny, just because.
Yeah, I mean, no sidekicks at all seems kind of boring, I guess. But, I specifically like writing military sci-fi because it kind of lends itself naturally to putting people from disparate situations together to a common goal, or usually a common goal. And that just creates a lot of opportunity for interesting dynamics. And I mean, I think there's certainly a case for separating your main character from those sidekicks, especially when they need them, and forcing them kind of out of their comfort zone, and maybe thinking back and about what that side character has taught them in the past, and then applying that, and then you get to see some character growth. So there's ways of playing around with having them there and then not there. I'm not totally sure I would ever write a story that has 0 sidekicks at all, but I'm sure it exists and is interesting. But
I mean, again, I'll draw that distinction between sidekicks versus secondary characters in that it's hard for me to imagine writing a story without secondary characters unless it's like a monologue of a person trapped inside a box. So secondary characters are, almost always present, but I default to not having sidekicks. I don't think that, the majority of stories require sidekick specific characters unless they are called for. And I think the litmus test of whether or not a sidekick is called for is whether or not the protagonist, not necessarily the main character, but the protagonist in a story needs a helper to either complete their journey or to have their journey be relatable and accessible to the reader. And that's where I think the sidekick character specifically is very useful. So I would actually default to like not writing the sidekick unless you start in on the story and then you realize actually the sidekick character is going to be really valuable here.
Yeah. It's the same in my case. I don't tend to write sidekicks. I did write a sidekick on the first book of my current series, The Age of Rekindling, on the Daughter of the Ice, because it was the main point of view was that of an old knight. So again, a lot of the character was about him going on his last adventure and passing on the baton to younger adventurers. So he had 2 actually sidekick kind of characters, and that was the main character, right? One of the main arcs of the book was the passing of the baton. So in that case, it made sense. But yeah, in general, my stories, thrive more on secondary characters than necessarily, sidekicks. Most of the characters that I follow, that my books follow, I have more of they have more of a, I don't want to say the independent aspect, but they work. It's more like 2 important characters or 2 independent characters, or more work as a team rather than one being subordinate to the other.
I would argue if you even had like a book that was just a monologue of somebody in a box, if they're thinking about people that they care about, they're probably still secondary characters. As far as the sidekick goes, I agree that if you don't need it, then don't put it in. I think it's like one of those things where you kind of have to examine, well, how is this character reinforcing the themes of the story? How are they moving the internal conflict of the main character along? Are they moving the external conflict along? If they're not doing anything like that, I just don't feel like you need them. That's when I would not put one in.
I think it's funny. I was just thinking, because I've had, I guess, 17 novels published, and probably most of them have sidekicks. But when they don't, the ones where there is no sidekick, it's because one of the things that sidekicks disempower in a narrative is if you need a sense of isolation and anxiety, if you need your main character to be experiencing, disconnection and solitude or isolation, then when you have a sidekick, that kind of removes a little bit of that energy. And so and if you're writing a fish out of water story, which, in one sense, all books at some point, the main character is some kind of fish out of water from some kind of context that they've gotten themselves into. But, it's trickier to do that if you've got sort of a sidekick, along the way, because it can remove some of that tension. Like, that's what the beauty of sidekicks is, that you can have the darkest, most terrible scene imaginable, and they can still kind of give you this way of attenuating the experience for the reader of injecting humor or injecting heart or injecting whatever you want. But if what you need in that moment is that sense of isolation or disconnection, the character trapped with their own thoughts, for example, then that's a good time to sort of either not have a sidekick or, get them off the stage for a while.
Absolutely. So, and we can start from Tommy. Tell us about 2 side characters in fiction that you find iconic. Not necessarily because they're your absolute favorites, but you can, of course, but because of their function to their stories, and you cannot say the usual suspects. So Robin doesn't count. You can say Robin.
No. I actually, I know exactly who I want to talk about for this. I read a book out of order once. I read a book called Ender's Shadow instead of Ender's Game. And I did not realize until talking with a friend months later that Bean was not the main character, that, it was supposed to be Ender. So I've always approached that series and those books from a very different perspective, which has probably played into my whole writing a sidekick as the main character series. But I really like how in either one of the books, the secondary character Bean is really there to help push Ender, help him figure out what he needs to figure out at the different stages of that story. And I love that he wrote the same book from 2 different perspectives, so you can see all of the little nuances of each character and who they really are, which again, I think really goes into what we talked about earlier of just making sure you have every character fleshed out enough to know what it is that drives them, whether they are the main character or the secondary character.
Okay, can I go or? Okay, so when I was thinking about this, I'm going to embarrass Fonda because a secondary character that I find iconic is Barrow from Greenbone Saga, and he's not my favorite character. I hate him. He's terrible, but he's like this weed that you just can't kill, right? Like you thrown boiling water on him, you salted the earth, you stomped on him, and then finally you're like, well, okay, let's just see what happens. And then he takes the story in very interesting and intriguing directions. Just he like flips in and out, right? And he just puts his thumb a little bit on the scale, and then it has these bigger repercussions for the actual main characters in the story. So definitely an iconic secondary character for me.
I'm so delighted to hear you say that, Andrea. I love how frustrated people get with him.
He's so frustrating. It is. It's like a weed you just can't kill that you're like, why is this still here?
Yeah. So I thought of a ton of these, and I was trying to think of ones that, a wider audience might think of. And the first one that came to mind for me was Uncle Iroh from Avatar. I love those side characters that are loyal and willing to sacrifice, but they're also just willing to tell the unvarnished truth and really push the character forward and out of their comfort zone. That's always a big one for me that I really like to see. So, and he just has this sort of very slowly unfolding backstory that you learn over time, and it's super sad, and you just understand so much, and watching it a second time, then you're kind of backfilling that, knowing that information. And I like those that kind of build on themselves and that make that second watch or that second read through even more fulfilling after you do it.
Yeah, I guess it's my turn. I thought a bit about this question because, I always tend to draw blanks on all the books I've read when I actually really need to think about a specific example. But I kept coming back to a very simple but very effective side character that's Puck from Berserk. And just because those books, especially, the first volume, right? It's so grim and so bloody, and gets, going back to what we're talking before, it's such an unrelatable, just incredibly grim, incredibly ill-disposed character, right? That doesn't seem to care about anything other than just, killing demons. The little fairy really shines a bit of light, right, in his disposition, in his character. And he basically spends the whole of the first volume of the manga just trying to get rid of her and being mean to her. but it's enough that she's there and that she tries to engage him in some sort of conversation to get me to humanize the character a little bit. And I think I wouldn't have been able to stand if Puck wasn't there. I don't think I would have been able to stand going through the first volume just because he's he gets by himself. It's such an ass. He might have reasons, right, to be like that, but it's just too unpleasant a character to be alone with.
I guess I'll jump in. So one that's a sidekick that's kind of iconic for me is Loyush from Stephen Brust's Vlad Taltos books. Sorry, this is one of them. This was the first one. This is the first book I read that got me into fantasy when I was a teenager. And Loyush is a kind of a tiny dragon that Vlad, the main character, has as a sort of a familiar. But because Vlad is basically like an assassin and a kind of low-level mob boss, Loyush refers to him as boss all the time. And so I just remember just giggling my head off at this little dragon that goes, "I think they're out to get us, boss." And just that sort of being able to create that relationship, I always thought was really nice. And so, I stole some of that when I was writing Rikus in the Spellslinger books, where I decided I wanted a sidekick who did not consider himself a sidekick to the main character, but was a business partner. And therefore, every time he's doing something for Kellen, kind of expects to be paid in some fashion or another, which I sort of enjoyed. And the other one, in Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Harper Hall trilogy, Menely, who's the main character, one of my Dragon Song is one of my favorite books. There's a character called Pimer, who's just this young kid who's just gets into trouble and stuff. But he's for me, he's such a fun example of the character that it allows you to have a main character who's not overly confident, because there's this other side character, the sidekick, who's constantly going, "You're way better than those other ones. You're a better singer than them. You're just as important as them." And it's just, it can allows you to have really fun kind of sentimental vibes when you want to pull on those strings. So those are two for me.
I'll name just two classics to finish it off, and specifically because we've been talking about the roles that sidekicks can play, right? One of them being to help a hyper competent individual who is a protagonist, and my example for that would be Q from James Bond, right? Like, James Bond is too cool to pay attention to how the fancy gadgets work or to be like a techie dude, so he needs like someone like Q who's just going to be like, here's all the gadgets that are like going to come into play in some climactic moment. And then the other one is Chewbacca, right? He takes like a character like Han Solo, who is really just an asshole, but like, when you meet him, Han Solo goes from being like, I'm an asshole guy, to the lovable rogue that he is because of his relationship with Chewbacca. And that's like the other role that we talked about with sidekicks, which was humanizing a main character. And I think he does that really well for Han.
Yeah. Yep. So I have a question, if you guys don't mind, because it just came to me as Sebastien was talking about. How do you guys feel about sentient weapons? Do they count as sidekicks?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
they can be.
I'm trying to think of one. I know that there's got to be one, but just like, but yeah, no, 100%.
Does the ring count?
Yeah.
Is that a sidekick though?
Yeah. Or secondary character.
I mapped out a whole a novel at one point that I was going to write, because I'd seen one of those big shields with the embossed face on it. And I was kind of obsessed with the idea of, well, what if it started speaking and it was a being trapped in the shield and stuff? And so for me, that kind of worked. I just like the idea of somebody with a shield that keeps yammering at them, and then every time something hits the shield, they're like going, "Ow, ow." But I think for it to be a sidekick, there has to be some kind of element of interaction with the with that character. So I don't know if the One Ring would really sort of work for that, because it doesn't spend Frodo doesn't have a lot of really deep, thoughtful conversations with the One Ring, but who knows? But I think Sam Sykes, didn't he wasn't one of his books about that, a guy carrying a sword that has a spirit in it that kind of talks to him and keeps trying to encourage him to kill people.
And Gareth Hanrahan with the Sword Defiant most recently. Same principle of a sentient sword with spirit and very sassy. So, did everyone get a go for their answer? Yes. So, since we spoke about some iconic ones, someone brought up a question for what are some of the least successful sidekicks? And if you can think of any.
I have one.
Go
I
ahead.
can't believe I finally get to say this. The goddamn owl in Harry Potter. I hate that kind of like thing where you have the character, like a sidekick, who's just so completely devoted to the main character that they lose any form of, identity. And so, you get the owl, I think, in the first book, and the owl gets referred to periodically and does stuff for Harry, but never, I think, I don't want to spoil anything, but when something happens to the owl later in the series, I really had trouble finding myself feeling anything about it. So for me, that, it was odd because in such an incredibly successful series from a narrative standpoint overall, that was one element that just never felt like it came to life for me.
Yeah, maybe it's just due to me being a bitter old man, but I find most Disney movie sidekicks underwhelming. I mean, we talked about the Mulan dragon before. I actually like that. I actually don't dislike that one, but in general, I don't, I don't feel those, very, very quirky, very comic reliefy side characters. They just bore me.
Well, okay.
Not dissing your squirrel, by the way, Sebastien. Your squirrel is great.
Well, that's okay. Yeah, no, my squirrel's, got a lot of his own things. I was gonna try to goad you into naming a bunch of famous Disney sidekick characters that you hated, just to see so you could get tons of hate mail.
Yeah, I guess not.
Dishonor. Well, since we spoke about a lot of animal companions, it is a trope. And they're a classic for a reason, even if somebody hates them a little bit. So what do you think it is about non-human sidekicks that gets to us so much? And whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
Well, I think a lot of people have pets. So we all have like our own little sidekicks. Like I have like one of mine right back there right now. They just hang out with you all the time. And they're amazing. And you have like these relationships with them that I think people who don't have pets don't understand. So having an animal companion, I feel like just intensifies that because oftentimes they have, yes, okay. So you do have animal companions sometimes that are just animals. And it's nice to see that kind of relationship reflected. But then sometimes you have animal companions that just go like a step more where it's like, okay, they have magic or they can talk. And it's this feeling of wish fulfillment. Like, what would my animal companion say to me if they could talk? People will even do like voices for their animals and stuff too. I just think I think there is like a lot of elements of wish fulfillment and also just seeing your relationship that you have in fiction. It makes it feel relatable.
Yeah, that's a key point. And, it's funny because people with pets do tend to relate better to animal companions than sometimes to actual characters. I don't think in the whole Drizzt books, I don't think I've ever suffered as much for wanting a character not to be hurt than for Guinevere, right? That is the character. My number one concern when reading those books is nothing happened to the panther, right? That is the one that I don't want the author to touch.
Yeah. It's a well-known edict among fiction writers, right? Like, don't kill the dog, because like that's how you get hate mail. Like that's how you're getting canceled as an author, right? Like, so in a way, I think the not to say that animal companions have not died in truly heartbreaking ways, but there is a certain amount of like very relatable comfort and safety to the animal sidekick character, the non-human sidekick character, because exactly as Andrea said, it's like a reflection of how we have relationships to animals in our own lives.
It's funny the don't kill a dog thing. So Rikus, so I have a Soulbinder, which is the 4th Spellslinger book. When that book came out, because of what happens in the book, I would get these unbelievably angry letters and emails from people constant, and they because they hit a certain point in the book, and I'd be like, well, yeah, things happen. So, or you could read the rest of the book, and then like a week later, I'd get these emails that were so delightedly happy and thrilled. And I was like, yeah, too bad you can't take away the one you wrote saying I'm a piece of crap. How dare I do something like this? This is a clear sign that I'm a bad human being deep down. I must secretly want to hurt it. It was hilarious. But one of the things, one of my first discoveries when I was writing, Rikus as an animal character, where I think I literally said to my wife, I'm never writing another book without a talking squirrel cat, is that there's all kinds of things that animal companions can say that human characters can't and get away with. And you're just like, oh my God, it just opens up a whole wide arena of inappropriate jokes that I could not have my human character say. But when the squirrel cat says it, it's hilarious. And I think part of that is because, and again, going back to where Andrew started about people and pets, is that, I think it's just true that so many people who've had pets who have, those relationships with animals kind of always wish they could talk, and imagine them talking. And so, that's one of the sort of wish fulfillment things that we get out of, animal companions, is that sense of, yes, they are sentient, yes, they do have thoughts and feelings about us, which those of us who own cats know that our cats don't actually care about us remotely and would not remember our names. And if we were to die, would mostly lie on us for warmth until we got cold, and then leave us there or possibly eat us.
So I wrote a novella that had a human-animal relationship at its core, but this animal companion was very much an animal. And on the flip side, when you have an animal companion that does not talk back to you, I think one of the roles that can play is as the confidant, right? Because we all have that experience where we can say anything to our pets, right? We can talk to our cat or dog, and we know that like this isn't being recorded for posterity. It's not going to come back, when our emails are like scoured for evidence. They're safe. And so there's that element of like, you can have a substitution almost for like the mental interiority of your character by having your character confide with full trust in this reliable animal sidekick.
Yeah, unless they're secretly a druid.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
That's true.
Shapeshifter.
Never know when that's going to happen.
It's actually what Fonda said. Yeah, it's absolutely true. So a recent book of mine called Crucible of Chaos was one of the first times I had an animal sort of companion that didn't talk, and it's a mule. But Estevar Boros, he's the main character. He's this sort of swashbuckling Hercule Poirot style detective. And when he's trying to work through the problems of the crime, he's recounting all this in elaborate detail to the mule. And every time the mule like snuffles or shuffles or farts, Estevar acts like the mule is therefore commenting on what he's saying. Oh, you're right, I hadn't considered that maybe this was just an act someone was putting on. So that can really be fun too. I think something Luis alluded to earlier, which is that like these things they're very, I think from a writer's standpoint, they're fun tools to work with. They're quite easy to work with in some ways, but the challenge is if they become a device, if they just become a comic relief device or any of those things, then it sort of falls apart. And so you have to be conscious of that.
I think sometimes they can also show how like your character is being actually fairly good, or even if they are already good, it can show how deserving they are of trust. Like I just think of Hero and the Crown, the horse Talat and Aaron, and she basically like rides this horse into battle with the dragon, and she's put this ointment on it that's going to protect it from fire. And if you've ever interacted with horses, they are like scared of everything. So you realize like in that moment how intensely this horse trusts this person. And so if this horse is like willing to put their trust in her, like you feel like she's more trustworthy, she's more deserving of that.
combining what you said with what Fonda said, you can have your character tell an animal companion something that humanizes them on a level that they might not be able to say to another person. You think they're an unfeeling person, someone who is going along and doing whatever they want, but they then, turn and protect their animal companion, or, open the door so that their animal companion can run away. Like, it gives them that, I mean, we're all animal people, I think. So, I mean, it gives you, it's that running back into the building to save your dog type of thing, or your cat, or whatever your animal is. It helps make them show their thought process through their actions, rather than having them sit there and, explain their reasoning of why they were putting the oil on the horse in the first place.
Well, I mean, John Wick is like a stone cold murderer, right? Like how many people has John Wick killed? But then you're like, oh, well, but what they did to his dog, like, I'm totally on board. Like, I understand now, he's, a hero to me.
Exactly. It's a redeeming object, right? You think that this person is a terrible human being, and you're judging them, but then he or she is kind to an animal, and you're like, oh, maybe I misjudged. Maybe he has a reason for being so bitter and mean and mad at everything all the time.
That's very Save the Cat, right?
Save the cat, literally. Yeah. Literally save the cat.
Or revenge the dog.
Yeah. But it's also an opportunity, right? It's an opportunity to, if you have a character, for example, who's not that brave, and you suddenly have them behaving bravely, sometimes it feels a little, even if they're rescuing someone else's kid from a fire, it can feel a little bit like, well, you made them brave when they needed to, but it's somehow easier to have them be brave for the animal that they've been with, and kind of rewarding. And I guess it just says something about human beings. But sorry, I didn't want to go on too much.
Jen, did you have a chance to chime in?
Yeah, no, just listening. I totally agree. Like Andrea said, I talk to my dog all the time, so it just is a natural thing to put it in a book. I've never written that. I don't know if I ever would in a sci-fi necessarily have a talking animal. I guess you could. But the one example that comes to mind that I'd like to bring up, I don't know if you guys have read, it's a Kevin Hearn series called The Iron Druid Chronicles. And there's a dog called Oberon, and he's the best character in fiction. He's amazing. Basically, the main character, through his druid powers, can hear the dog talk, so they talk that way. It doesn't talk out loud, but they talk in their heads. And then later in the series, spoiler alert, the dog gets his own POV chapters and stuff. And I also listened to the audiobook, so I think the way that Luke Daniels reads it is also part of it. But it's just brilliant the way that the voice is done, and the how they managed to have a character arc for this dog in these books. And it's really entertaining and very like a comfort read, like we've kind of been saying. It's a comforting wish fulfillment thing to get to go on and druidic adventure with your dog. That would be so amazing. So
those books absolutely saved my sanity when I was out with a concussion, the audio. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
They're so good.
Yeah. They're so good. Yeah.
So going back a little to more human characters, possibly, we have another question from Arun, and he was saying thoughts on complementary characters versus contrasting. So Sam and Frodo and versus Holmes and Watson examples. And I don't know, whoever wants to go. Jenny, you go.
Sure. So obviously they both have their places, depending on what you're trying to achieve with them. I think personally I gravitate more towards the contrasting, especially when it's sort of two people, maybe not Holmes and Watson wise, but when it's two people sort of learning to meet in the middle, that's kind of just character arc wise something that really interests me. So I think I might lean towards that, but at the same time, Sam's amazing, and I don't even know that I would consider him a sidekick, honestly. I feel like he's almost a primary character, but yeah, I think they kind of both have their time and their place, and you just kind of need to think about what's going to serve the story the best and what's going to serve the main character's character arc the best, in terms of what they need to get to where you want them to be by the end of the book.
Yeah, I think we're all nodding along because
Yeah.
that's true. It depends on what the story needs, right? Contrasting, we've talked a bit about this before, right? Sometimes we have a character that's so high up there that we need a vehicle for the reader to approach it. And, in that case, contrasting is probably the way to go, right? That it's the case of Holmes and Watson. I think that was the actual example that Sebastien gave, if I remember correctly. The conversation, it's late, so but in other cases, right, you don't need. I mean, Frodo is a perfectly approachable character. You don't need Sam's point of view to get to know Frodo better, but you enjoy the relationship between the characters. That relationship is a relationship that actually speaks more to Sam's character, right, than Frodo's character. It's a lot to your point. It's I would see Sam as a main character as well, because you get a lot of his actions, right, define a sort of nobility, right? That's a big theme of the work. So that's not necessarily a case of POV to help the reader approach the character. So in that case, it makes more sense for them to be complementary.
Yeah, the one thing I'll say about this is I don't think that these two categories are mutually exclusive. I especially like relationships that evolve from initially being contrasting to complementary. So I'm writing a duology right now where there's a relationship, probably my favorite in the books, that starts off as contrasting. Basically, it's a sort of a rivals relationship. They're essentially frenemies. But due to the events of the story, they end up becoming allies. And so the main character, Jun, and his rival, Yinue, become complementary characters over the course of the story. And that's like a really fun dynamic to play with. And vice versa. You can have that kind of like friends to enemies dynamic as well, where like characters start off as complementary, and then the events of the story and their respective journeys take them apart, and they end up sometimes on opposite sides of an issue or on opposite sides of a conflict. So I like both. I think they're both really valuable. And like, as Luis said, it depends on whether or not your character needs help in that moment or whether they need to be challenged in that moment. And sometimes that calls for a certain role for the course of the story, and sometimes it calls for that role to evolve.
I think in some ways it's easier to write contrasting characters, than it is to write complementary ones, or characters that are very different in that sense. Like, for example, imagine you're writing two characters, and one of them is very rich and the other is very poor, and they're on this journey together. Everything that comes up, you can imagine how that contrast will allow you to elucidate what's going on. Like they're at a tavern and the poor character's like, this is too expensive, we should camp out in the woods, and the main character, the rich character, sorry, is, well, what are you talking about? Like those different expectations. If you've got two characters that are both of the same sort of social class, for example, and they're wandering into a place, then you sort of lose that dimension, that sort of ability. It makes it harder to triangulate. But on the flip side, it's easier, I think, in some ways to find nuance when you have sort of complementary characters. Frodo and Sam aren't really that different, but they do have different perspectives about the degree to which the world outside the Shire is different from, operates on a different set of, physical laws or rules than in the Shire. Frodo is like, this isn't the Shire, nothing works this way, we're just hobbits, blah, blah, blah. And Sam is like, well, no, there's still like bacon and, plants, and, it's not that different. We just got to do this thing. And so it's the nuance is kind of fun to achieve. But I think if I was starting out and I was going to write my first book and I was like, I want to have a sidekick, I think I would attempt something that was more contrasting, just because it makes it just easier to illuminate the world and the action around you.
Okay, so, and we can just see some of the other questions too. So, thoughts on characters who are far more than they seem, but they're happy to slum it as a sidekick. Bug of the Hoe and Bug Duo from Malazan is iconic too. A question.
I think that goes back to making sure you know what the all of your secondary characters' backstories are, having an actual reason why some character might want to slum it as a sidekick. And I can't think of an example right off the top of my head, but I know it's been used before to show, that sidekick character who has the best example is the grandfather teacher figure who, comes along and helps you train Mr. Miyagi. You know what his story is at the end of the movie, but at the beginning he's just, the neighbor. But he kind of is the sidekick who teaches Daniel to, continue his own story, his own journey. So I think that those kinds of characters, again, you do just need to make sure that you have their own story, their own reasoning behind it before you try to write a more powerful sidekick than the main character.
Yeah, I actually love those kinds of characters. I don't recall off the top of my head many examples in books, but you'll probably appreciate this, Tommy, because I do recall them a lot in video games, right? This is a type of character very common in role-playing games. That's the old grizzled veteran that's tagging along, and they could save the world themselves, but they're just living it for the young ones now, and they'll just go tag along and give their support, right? I actually find that very endearing in a way. It's a character archetype that I personally enjoy.
I'm just thinking of Solus from the Dragon Age series. Now you mentioned video games where you're like, oh, he's just like one of my companions, and then you find out, oh, actually he's like the big bad.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually those characters can be a great source of surprise, right? Because you have a backstory for them potentially, and you can use that to great effect if the occasion calls for it, right? And they can end up being really surprising, interesting characters. I mean, we're all, even though in our own minds we're all the protagonists of our own story, we are probably sidekicks to someone in our life, right? Like, I have 2 teenage children. I'm just their sidekick. That's what they think of me as. They're like, Mom, why aren't you driving? Like, we need you to drive you to this and that place. And then they're surprised that I have to do a live stream for, TBRCon because I'm not available. They're like, oh, you have your own life. Like, there's people are always, you probably are, have a sidekick role. Like, we all probably are a sidekick role in some way. So I think that just kind of keeping that in mind, that you can, it's not necessarily slumming it. Like, being a sidekick is hard, as parents know. It's a lot of work, and I'm sure Tommy's protagonist knows. It's not an easy thing to be like, oh, I'm just a sidekick. Like, it's a lot to be a sidekick.
Support.
You're probably doing a ton of work, but and then the main protagonist comes in and takes all the credit. Says someone who just spent the whole weekend, at their kids' sports tournament filling water bottles.
See, I have 2 cats, so I'm less a sidekick and more of a butler.
Yeah,
I'm also an Uber driver, snack preparer, all those roles.
Okay, so we touched on this earlier a little bit with someone, but were there secondary characters that you've written for whom reader reactions were unexpected? And Fonda, you can start. Just follow the line.
I mean, I wouldn't say the reaction was unexpected, because my most memorable secondary character is one of my most hated characters I've ever written, and I love it. I love that he's just so hateable, because he has a really specific role in that story, in that he was extremely helpful to me as the writer to illuminate aspects of that world that the main POV characters wouldn't and couldn't. So a reader reaction is very passionate about Barrow, and I was under a lot of pressure at all points to see him to a grisly death. But I actually think another secondary character for who maybe the reaction was less expected, but that I really felt satisfied by was this character named Lo Jin. He's a character that shows up multiple points throughout this long trilogy and is not a main POV character, but is one of those characters that's just so crucial to like the workings of what's going on in the clan throughout the course of the series, and has this sort of tension-filled relationship with Andon, who's one of the main POV characters. So I've gotten he's become the fan favorite, and I am always pleased to see him get to get that fan reaction, because it's not easy to have a character command a lot of fan engagement when you're not ever in that character's POV. But I think implying a lot of things through a secondary character's actions and their relationships to the POV characters lets readers understand them sometimes in ways that allows them to be extrapolated upon. So oftentimes the secondary characters are the ones that will inspire fan fiction or will inspire readers to like write to you and ask you questions and want to know more about that character.
Yeah.
Based on Andrew's comments alone, I'm guessing you did a very good job with the one that's most hated.
For sure.
Looking forward to reading him. I have the book on my shelf.
That's harder to do. It's harder to get people to passionately hate, right? A character that's not necessarily a villain, right? Than to actually have people love them. But yeah. So the whole concept, right, of Legends of Elysia is that it's a shared world where these people inhabit and where these adventures happen. So it was always my design to have characters that are secondary characters in one series be primary characters in their own series, etc. And the fates and of these peoples intersect during their journey. So that was always kind of baked in my original plan for the overarching series. But I encourage my readers to reach out to me often, and I do encounter sometimes characters that tickle them in unexpected ways. There's a dog, which I don't want to talk too much about because I still haven't written the dog side story to its conclusion, right? But there's a dog that goes around, and when sometimes when the heroes are in need, weird stuff happens because the dog is around. And I've had more than one email saying, "What's up with the dog? What's that all about?" And yeah, I actually know what the dog's all about, but I'm not ready to reveal that yet. So that is an uncomfortable conversation that I've had with more than a couple of readers.
So I think that I might be the only one, as far as I know here, that releases on a more serial schedule. I put my story on Royal Road, it goes on my Patreon, and then once I finish a book, it gets all bundled up, and that's when you can buy it and listen to it. So secondary characters for me are a lot of fun because I know my story structure, I know where I want to go, but I pants a little bit of side quests, so to speak. So I get to introduce these characters that people then feel very strongly about. And when I get somebody, when I get a buttload of comments about, "Oh my God, that character Amir was amazing. We love him so much." Okay, cool. I can go explore that and figure out how he works into, this other story plot that I already wanted to write, but now I can use him as the device to work into, what's going on at the local hospital. On the flip side, I've gotten lots of hate for one of my main characters because she is the only one from the world who's helping the two characters from our world, but she has a very different perspective on life than they ever had. So keeping with her upbringing of always being right and being the princess type character, they rub heads a little bit, and so people are always, why does Maddie get away with so much, and why does she talk to them like that? Well, that's who she is, and it's her growth and her journey through the story is going to be mellowing out and learning to negotiate and take not her choice in what they do each time. So for me, at least, it's really fun watching the characters, watching the readers react to my different characters and knowing that I've got major plans for these characters that you hate, and I'm going to make you love them. Or those ones that you absolutely love, I hope that they live long enough for you to find their whole story.
Lightly ominous.
So yeah, I don't get a ton of messages or tags about secondary characters specifically, but if I do, it's usually along the lines of like, I totally ship X and Y, when are they going to get together? To which the answer is almost always that they're not, but that's what fan fiction is for if you're interested. But I've also definitely had the experience with like critique partners and beta readers, and that's a good time to like gauge, is this character coming off like I thought they were? And sometimes it is in a different direction, and at that stage of the writing process, you know, when you're still with critique partners, you can sort of lean into that or lean out of it if you want to. But I've definitely had the experience of like beta readers just loving a side character and being like, okay, I really need to make sure that this person doesn't just not show up in the next book. You know, they need to continue to be there because people really enjoy them and I need to develop them further.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's a note that I constantly get from beta readers is, thank you for not having killed X, Y, and Z.
I don't usually get those emails.
For very good reason, Fonda.
Don't know what those are like.
Yeah, I think for me, the one that surprised me was how many people disliked one of my POV characters in the first book, Ranami, who's like a revolutionary. And the reason is because she tells a lie to her girlfriend to get her involved in this rebellion. And so people were really like angry at her about that. And for me as the author, I'm like, I love all my characters. I know why they're doing this, you know? So for me, I'm like, you know, they're young. Their relationship is kind of like a little up and down right now. They're not like completely emotionally stable yet. So like, I totally understand why she did that. And then I think that readers did like forgive her as the series moved on and their relationship matured and the characters matured. But it did surprise me because to me, I'm like, I completely understand why she's doing this. Not that I condone it, but the amount of people that disliked her for that, I think, was definitely surprising for me.
I agree with that dislike, as it is very fresh for me. I finished the book this morning. I understand also, but I still dislike.
I think that's one of the virtues of secondary characters is that, you know, your primary characters sort of, you kind of have to put them through an arc in a book, even if it's a series. You know, there's usually a sense of they're going to do this arc, and it's hard to mask the fact that they have an arc in a book, because that's in a sense why readers are picking up the book. It's what we expect in the kinds of stories we tend to tell. But with secondary characters, you have the option of making an arc happen much more gradually over a longer period of time. And so I had that. I remember, so in my first book, there was a character who was a pretty villainous guy named Duke Gillard, and I wanted people to hate him, and I hated him. And when I was starting to write the second book, I had these ideas about him evolving a little bit and us seeing different sides of him, partly because through his son. And I remember I had written this giant outline for the second book in the series, and Joe Fletcher, my editor, wrote back and said, "You are not allowed to redeem Duke Gillard." So next I wrote back and said, "Well, now I've decided I am definitely redeeming Duke Gillard." I said, "Well, you can't do it in one book." And so, of course, I ended up having to give him that very gradual arc that was really fun, because you're not expecting to always see it every chapter. You're not expecting to watch it happen in real time. And so for readers, it's funny. I remember when the fourth book came out, when this character dies, and this was a pretty villainous character in the first book. I was getting all of these letters from readers who were like telling me they were sobbing over Duke Gillard. And I was like, please turn your attention to book 1, chapter 12, and try to remember what he did. But it was really, but I think, but that's because you get that advantage as the writer, that you can actually allow that to just happen much more gradually. And I think it's something, you know, we can sort of learn from romance writers. I hadn't understood romance series until very recently, because it wasn't a genre that I tended to read in. But I was always like, how do you have a romance series? How do you have a 12-book romance series? How many times can one couple fall in love? Or are they just, you know, and then I finally understood, okay, it's because, like you said, it in a town or on a ranch or somewhere. And so a secondary character in book 1 is who's going to end up falling in love in book 2. And I think there's a lot to learn from that, because when people are writing those books, they kind of have to think in terms of who's going to pick up the baton next from a story standpoint. And even if, you know, when I tend to write a series, it tends to be a main character who's going to be throughout the main series. But if I remind myself, hey, like, you've got to let these secondary characters kind of keep growing, so that at a certain point they all have sort of culminating arcs. I think that's a really, it's a different texture to the kind of classic sort of hero's journey or heroine's journey that, you know, that, depending on how we apply those things, it just gives us that other texture to play with, and that's really rewarding, I think, as a writer.
Yeah.
I also still have feelings over the Duke. And I read those books years ago. My feelings. You people are hurting my feelings. So we need to start leading towards our outro. However, one last question. So, what are some other older or hidden gem reads with great secondary characters? And we can start with Tommy.
Oh, man. Put me on the spot. I'm blanking on the name, so I'm just going to go with The Three Musketeers, because it's another Alexandre Dumas book. Basically, any of the actual Three Musketeers, and there are such great classic characters and tropes of their own caricatures who help the main hero in the story. I guess that's one that's I've always really loved. I love Dumas. I'll read any of it. Come back. I'll try to think of something else.
I'll throw in mine. So one of my early science fiction loves was the Robot series by Asimov. And there's a kind of buddy cop duo consisting of a human police officer and his robot partner, Daniel Oliva, who's a great secondary character because he fulfills a lot of the roles of a sidekick that we're talking about. You know, the main character starts off very kind of anti-robot, very put out to be partnered with a partner who's a non-human, and then they develop this incredibly close working relationship. And because Daniel is a non-human character, he kind of illuminates the human side, right? And can do all sort of can play that, like, you know, the thing that you know, robot or android characters often do, which is to like be the foil for humanity, right? And kind of be like, oh, this, like, humans are so interesting, and like, but he is, but also they're somehow extra human, like they're both non-human but also superhuman in the sense that they're like, they exaggerate the things that make us human because they're trying to emulate humans. So that was a character that I thought was really effective as a secondary character, a sidekick character in sort of classic science fiction.
Yeah, so I mean, I love these questions because it allows me to always talk about one of my favorite series ever, which is the Draenei saga. And specifically, I mean, almost all of the books that have great secondary characters. And speaking of secondary characters that steal the show, on the first book, you know, Legend, which, you know, I expected to be centered on the titular legend, Druus. It's actually, there's actually not that much chapters, you're right, about him. There are a few, but there's so much emphasis on all the secondary characters, you know, around them that I feel that is one book where most of the secondary characters steal the show. At the end of the day, if you would ask me who is the main character there, I wouldn't even say it's Druce. I would probably say that it's one of the supposed secondary characters. So yeah, that would be my tip. The Draenei saga in general has fantastic secondary characters.
Well, and Legend doesn't even open with Druce. It's I can't remember his name, but he's ends up being a bit more of a main character. You're right. Yeah, I've read a bunch of those books, and there's always really good secondary characters. I'll plug Stephen Bruce's Vlad Taltos series again, because it's funny. He does something really interesting with this, which is he doesn't make all the secondary characters instantly these very complicated whole people. He gives you something very specific about them, something that you can hang on to that's kind of interesting. Because there's so many of them, they don't show up, constantly. So, and in doing that, like I can remember the names of, a half a dozen secondary characters from a book that I've read since, but I first read when I was 16 years old. And so I think it's a really fun one. And I always feel like this is a really good sort of instructive kind of book if you're thinking about, trying your first fantasy novel, because you'll find all these characters and each have some kind of interesting quirk that comes up. And that, when they turn up on the page again, you kind of have a sense of how they're going to respond to what's going on. And that itself is quite fun to watch. And then over time, as those characters, get more and more depth, you're kind of ready for it. You're not over, like there's some fantasy novels that I'll pick up now, like in the sort of epic fantasy genre, where I feel so overwhelmed as a reader just starting out, because everybody is so incredibly fleshed out, and there's just so much depth, and I don't know kind of who to follow. Whereas with Jared, you completely know who you're following, but you get to know these characters. And for me, in a way that almost feels more like the way that I meet people generally, right? Like I start out, I don't know very much about anyone, on the panel, but over time you get to know bits and more and more things, and that's a fun way of doing it. So that's a classic for me.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of cheat because I already mentioned it, but Iron Druid Chronicles is just on my mind now. But it's not only the dog. There's a bunch of other great secondary characters, other druids, and a grumpy old druid who's amazing. And there's just a lot of good examples. And it spans mythologies and worlds, and there's just a lot of different variety in there. Of secondary characters that support a rather powerful main character. So it is kind of interesting in that respect too.
If we're talking older books, I'm just going to throw out the Dragon Prince and Dragonstar trilogies by Melanie Ron. The first one was published in 1988, so it is an older series, but it has so many side characters. It's one of those vast epic fantasies, and there's this enormous cast, but they all feel like real people. And once you get into the second trilogy, like you start to see some of those secondary characters become main characters as well. So it's very interesting.
Nice development. So we are out of time, and this is the best news ever. So I want you to tell everybody where they can find you and what you have in store for us next with your work. So let's go around. Let's start from Fonda and go.
You can find me on, I'm increasingly off of social media for reasons, but you can find me online. FondaLee.com is my website. On Instagram, Fonda.Lee. And I have just launched a book. So I have a brand new release out called Breath of the Dragon, as I mentioned earlier. That's the first in a duology. That's young adult fantasy. It's a martial arts tournament inspired by Bruce Lee and his films and life. And then I have a science fiction standalone novel that is in the works that doesn't have a release date yet, but look for that probably sometime next year. And of course, I have all my backlist titles, which I hope you all check out.
Sebastien?
Oh, sorry. We're going. So yeah, I'm easy to find. My website is decastell.com. So DECASTELL.com, and I answer every email I get off of there, unless you are a Nigerian prince offering me money, which I don't know how many millions I've lost by failing to respond to those very reasonable letters. My latest book is Play of Shadows, which is the first in the Court of Shadows series, and it's a swashbuckling adventure, as I mentioned before, set in a theater with kind of actors, and the magic system is based around acting, which was kind of fun to kind of create. I'm sort of sporadically on social media, but all I pretty much ever do is go like or thank you for the kind review, because I'm terrified.
Yeah, so you can find my stuff at elisha.net. That's ELESSIA.net. And the website is not up to date, of course, because I spend all my time writing books. But I promise that now, as I finish this series, I will update it. That's a promise. And you can talk with me at on X at Authortube. I'm leaving the links in the chat. So my current series is Age of Rekindling. This is book 1, The Daughter of the Ice. It's a book about an old knight that has to summon a party together to investigate sightings of an old goddess. And the overarching theme of the series, it's an heroic fantasy with an overarching theme of magic returning to the world and how people deal with that. The last book in the series is called The Dragon of the Ice, and it releases on the 24th of February. So not long to go.
So yeah, you can find me at jsdewis.com, and then all my various social handles are jsdewis as well. I'm mostly only on Instagram, but I try to respond everywhere as much as I can. Speaking of side characters, I actually have a Patreon where I have various content for my main series, The Divide, but I actually have a short story series that is the backstories of all the characters. So I don't know if I said the premise earlier, but the premise is that our outcast soldiers sort of banished to the edge of the universe, so they're at this post at the edge of the universe. So the side character series is just the backstory of what each of them did in order to get sent out there. So it's sort of like the bad thing that they did. So that's been really fun to work on. I just released the third one just a couple weeks ago. So that's ongoing. And then there's other stuff on there like a wiki and a Discord and various sundry things. That's just patreon.com/jsdewis. So yeah.
Mine's very easy. I'm AndreaGStewart.com, and that is my handle on all the different social media sites. I'm extremely chaotic. I'm not on there that often. I'm not always good about answering my emails. I have a 2 and a 4-year-old. But the only thing I do consistently is write books. So my most recent release was The Gods Below, which is the start of a new trilogy called The Hollow Covenant, and edits are already in for book 2, so we're on schedule. And I'm actually writing some new stuff, but we'll see what happens with that.
You can find me at Patreon, SourpatchHero. I also release on royalroad.com, same pen name. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, X. Again, though, I don't like social media much, so it's sporadic if I'm on there. Book 2 of I'm Not the Hero came out August of last year. And book 3 comes out April 1st. Book 4 is already deep into the works as well, and hopefully by the end of the year, I'll have that one out as well.
Nice.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. And for those listening, make sure to tune into the rest of the week. We still have a bunch of amazing panels to come. You will see me again on Thursday. I'm sorry, or you're welcome. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you to the amazing authors for giving us the time.
Yeah, thank you for sticking around until so late in the night.
Yeah.
2 a.m. No, but I don't mind. Bye.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.